This is nearly the end. I stand between you and a reception with no doubt lots of alcohol and nibbly bits. And you must be the hardcore corporate governance aficionados to still be here. Now I realize you're busy. If you have to catch a flight, I won't take offense if you have to leave. So this is a paper joined with Conrad Raff in Norway. I've recently moved to Stockholm, so this is a Scandinavian paper. That's going to be about busy directors. And both Ron and Michelle set that up very nicely for me, since they talked about busy directors more than in passing. All right. So, busy directors. I'm busy. I'm a director, but I'm not a busy director. I'm not a busy director because I don't sit on enough boards to count as a busy director. And when we talk about busy directors, we should have in mind these kinds of people here. The Honorable William H. Gray III, who simultaneously sat in Congress and on 9 boards, and Stephen R. Hardis, who simultaneously was a CEO and sat on 8 boards. If you look at these names of the companies involved, these are not minor companies. I have no idea how these gentlemen manage their lives. I'm busy sitting on 1 board and can barely manage my life. Okay, so busy directors. Busy directors are controversial, and Ron almost equated them with being problematic directors. And I think there's a tendency out there in the public debate, and to some extent in the academic literature, to think of busy directors as being somehow bad. And indeed, if you think about the proxy advisory firms, they've been pushing companies to limit the number of directorships that their directors are allowed to hold, to limit the busy director phenomenon. And over the last 10 years or so, the number of S&P 500 companies that have some kind of limit in place on their directors holding other directorships has gone from 1/4 to 3/4. So the market is moving towards saying limit busy directorships. Now, the academic evidence is actually quite mixed. There are papers that show that it's a bad thing. Value declines, Q goes down, that kind of thing. But there are also papers that suggest that it's actually quite a good idea to have busy directors on the board. And that could have a number of different reasons. Probably not because they're busy, but because the kinds of directors who are in high demand are very valuable additions to your board. They bring something to the board that's very valuable. All right, so what we're going to try and do is to ask, when are busy directors a bad thing for shareholders, and when are they perhaps not a bad thing for shareholders? So derive conditions under which we can predict whether it's a good thing or a bad thing to have a busy director on the board. And we're going to do that theoretically. And I know it's like 5 p.m. on the second day, and you all want to go home, but there's theory here. And then we're going to take it to the data and see whether we can do some sort of fancy finance stuff, right? Exogenous shock to director attention, and see whether what we have to predict actually holds in the data. Okay, so what's new here is there's actually no prior model of busyness in the academic literature, which I found quite surprising. Renee has a wonderful survey article of the board literature, which is like this big, the board literature. And in there's a little bit of a section that talks about busy directors. And there they sketch in 1 or 2 paragraphs what a model might look like. And the kind of model that they have in mind is that there's a trade-off between time constraints, that's the bad thing, and some attribute like high ability or something like that, on the other hand. So you're getting a busy director that don't have much time, but they have something else, high ability or something like that, and now you get a trade-off. That's it. That's all there is in the literature. So we're going to try and generalize this general view that time constraints are bad, but there might be something that offsets it in 2 ways. The first way is that we're going to allow for there being monitoring synergies, as we call them, across companies. A negative monitoring synergy is simply a time constraint. If I have less time to monitor you, that's bad for you. But we're going to allow for the existence of positive monitoring synergies. And you can think of them as being, you learn something on this board that allows you to be a more effective monitor on that board. So there's perhaps information that you get to recycle, or insights that you get to recycle, or maybe networks that you have that allow you to become a better monitor. And the net of these, the time constraint and these positive synergies, will then determine whether across boards companies benefit or not from your presence there. And then there's a second thing that we throw into the mix, which links back to yesterday morning when Renee introduced the whole conference by talking about teams in the context of mutual funds. We're going to talk about teams in the context of boards. If you've ever sat on the board, you know that it's not a monolithic thing that makes decisions. It's a collection of individuals, and they have to work together. And there are ways in which you work very effectively with people, and there are ways in which you don't work effectively with people. So the interaction of people on the board is the second thing that we throw into the mix. And we're going to have strategic interaction. And there's a big literature in economics that thinks about strategic interaction between either companies or individuals or whatever it might be. And you can think of that as falling into two categories. Either strategic complements, if I do more, you do more, that's the best thing that you can do, that's your best response. Or strategic substitutes, if I do more, your best response is to do less. So it depends, it can go either way. All right, so the contributions that we're hoping to make is to throw these two new elements into the literature, the monitoring synergies and the strategic interaction. And interestingly, it turns out that neither is necessary or sufficient on its own to tell us whether having a busy director on the board is good or bad. It's the interplay between them that can tell us whether it's good or bad. And the second thing that comes out of the analysis is that contrary to the common intuition that's in René's sketch of a model, where you trade off time constraints against high ability, it's the busy directors whose skill is high relative to their co-directors who are a bad thing in this context. So for now, I'll just state that, and if I have time, I'll give you the intuition for that. OK. When we look at the data, we find that it can go either way. Sometimes busy directors are bad. Sometimes busy directors are good. And it's perhaps a little bit of a push, but we're hoping that the evidence, when it's good and when it's bad, lines up with the predictions that we have. Although that's a little bit of a heroic claim, because this is really difficult to identify for reasons that you're going to appreciate in a moment. OK. So there's a model. And Marco is gone. I saw him walk out. So Marco was a heavy-duty theorist in the room. With him not being here, I can just summarize what the model has in mind slide and get away with it, I hope. So the model is going to have two firms and two directors, of whom one director sits on both companies' boards. Okay, so it's the simplest possible setup that you can imagine for having this kind of cross-firm setup. The directors are going to defend their abilities, they're going to defend their incentives, both within company and across companies. So that's all fairly general. Then we're going to have monitoring, which is a costly exercise. So if you could get away with it, you'd do less of it. Monitoring is an exercise in getting information about the state of the firm in order to inform the action that the board can take. So that's a very classic sort of Tyrol-style setup. And it leads to directors Bayesian updating from the information that they already have with the information that they're gathering to a better information state and then better action that they can take. So it's a fancy economic way of thinking about what directors are supposed to be doing. Then we're allowing for these cross-firm synergies. The negative synergies are simply a kind of time constraint. If I spend more time here, I have less time to spend there. Very simple. And that's a reality of life. So we're going to allow every director to be subject to that. And then some directors will enjoy positive monitoring synergies, where they get to recycle the information or whatever it is that makes them a more effective monitor on the other company's board. This is not something we assume, it's something that we allow for. And then the net of the two, the time constraint and this recycling of information, will determine whether you've got net negative or net positive synergies. All right. Then we allow for strategic interaction amongst the directors on a board, which will determine how much monitoring you end up having on that board. If we are engaging in strategic complements, then the more I monitor, the more it pays Jeff to monitor too. You can think of it in the following way. If I monitor more, I'm making it easier for Jeff also to monitor more. If I'm showing up to every meeting, I'm making it easier for Jeff to learn from my insights and then make better insights in the next board meeting himself. And so we complement each other. But it could also be that we're engaging in strategic substitutability. I really, really want to stand out from the crowd. I want to impress the CEO. I want to impress everybody else. So if Jeff makes good contributions in the board meeting, he makes it that much harder for me to stand out from the crowd. He raises the marginal cost of me contributing to the board meeting. So I'm not going to do it. So it could go either way. All right. So now when you think about what's going to happen in this setup, two firms, two directors, where just the little m's are monitoring effort choices, and you shock one of the companies and trace out what happens at the other company. So what I'm going to do is take firm A. I'm going to make firm A shocked in the sense that the director who sits on firm A's board will optimally choose to spend more time with that firm. So maybe firm A is in crisis. Okay? So now director 1 at firm A is going to be distracted at firm A. And the question is, what's going to happen at firm B? Firm B has a solo director, firm B has a busy director. How is firm B affected by this scenario? So we've got monitoring going up at firm A. That's director being shocked there and spending more time there. There's going to be a direct effect on firm B, because that same director, the busy director, will have to reallocate their time and perhaps or perhaps not benefit from these monitoring synergies across firms. So we've got a direct effect there. And depending on the nature of the monitoring synergies across the two firms, you're going to have that joint director increase or decrease the monitoring effort at the other firm as well. So if it's negative monitoring synergies, they're busier at firm A, they have less time to spend at firm B, so their monitoring intensity at firm B will simply go down. If they benefit from these positive monitoring synergies, then even though they're busier, they're becoming a better monitor at firm B as well. So the monitoring intensity there will go up. So it depends. All right. There's some cool comparative statistics, which I'm not going to go into because it's late and we want to get to drinks. But of course, there's more going on than just director 1's effort reallocation. We also need to ask what's happening for the other director at the spillover firm's board. So that other director will now re-optimize her monitoring choice, given that her co-directors are busier elsewhere, has chosen to either monitor more or less on this board, depending on the nature of the monitoring synergies. So these guys are going to play their Bayesian Nash game, where they're doing the strategic complements or strategic substitutes. So when you crank through the algebra, you find what is completely intuitive, I think, that when you have positive synergies, then the joint director is going to monitor both companies more. And if it's complements, the other solo director is going to respond to the increase in monitoring by also monitoring more. So then you get a positive sign down there. If you've got negative synergies, the busy director monitors less at the spillover company. And so now we're here. And at strategic substitutes, the other directors do the opposite. So the busy director monitors less. Everybody else is going to monitor more. So there you get another positive sign, and so on. So once you have the model in place, I think this becomes very intuitive. Okay? And the final thing that I'm going to share with you before I go to the empirical setup is what's happening to the value of the other firm, firm 2, the spillover firm, as monitoring is adjusted. So there you get results that depend in perhaps a counterintuitive way. So it's summarized in this table. Whether you get positive increase in value of the other firm or negative decrease in value for the other firm is going to depend on whether we've got positive or negative synergies, and it's going to depend on whether we've got substitutes or complements. But it's not going to depend one for one. You see that in the first line there, it could either be positive or negative depending. So let's do the second line first, strategic complements, where it's unambiguous. There, everything is very intuitive, I think. If you've got monitoring synergies that are positive, then the busy director monitors both companies more. It's strategic complements. Everybody will respond to that by monitoring more. More monitoring is a good thing because you're gathering more signals which allow you to make a better informed decision at the board level, and then firm value goes up. And the opposite result is it's negative synergies. Monitoring goes down, everybody responds to that by monitoring less, and firm value falls. So I think that one works intuitively. So let's go to the slightly more difficult intuition. When you have strategic substitutes, it can become counterintuitive. So you have positive monitoring synergies, for example, and yet the value of the firm goes down. Or you have negative synergies, and yet the value of the firm goes up. So what's going on there? What's going on here is that the relative ability of the directors will play a role. So take the case where, for example, you've got positive synergies. The busy director is now monitoring more on both companies' boards. But it's strategic substitutes, so the other directors are responding to that by monitoring less. So one director is monitoring more, the other director is monitoring less. Now, if the busy director has lower ability than the other directors, then you're gaining bit extra monitoring from a relatively lower ability director, and you're losing monitoring from the relatively higher ability directors. And on net, the quality of monitoring goes down, and the value of the firm goes down, and then vice versa for the other case. All right, so empirically, what we're doing, good. Empirically, we're going to try and take this to the data, which is a really heroic exercise. So what do we need? We need 3 building blocks for this. This is not going to be easy. Okay, so we need a shock to the joint director's busyness at the first firm, firm A. That I can do, I think. Okay. Then we need a measure of each director's monitoring effort, and this is where it gets tricky. And then I need a way of signing the monitoring synergies across firms, which I think I can noisily do. So how do we address these? The first is an empirical setup that I've used in a couple of papers with Brian Kelly, where we're using shocks to a firm's information environment that come about because research departments of brokerage firms in the US have been closed down in large numbers over the last couple of decades. So imagine that you sit on the board of a company, and your company is being covered by, let's say, 4 analysts, okay? And you occasionally listen to what these analysts have to say to inform your job as a director on that board. And then from one day to the next, one of the 4 brokerage firms just closes down and fires all the analysts. So now you're losing one piece of external information on which you previously relied as a director. And you could ignore that, but you could also try and make up for this loss of the external information by spending more time with the company and trying to get internal information that helps you be an effective director on the board. So we've got a companion paper where we show that this is an effect that does exist in the data. And it's there, but not really when you're going from 50 to 49 analysts covering the company, but when you're going from, let's say, 5 to 4, it's there in the data. So we're going to use it as a shock to the attention that the director pays on one board. That sets the chain in motion that we're then tracing out when we look at the other firm's readjustment of monitoring, and that's what we're interested in. Measuring monitoring effort, this is the tricky one. Happily, Ron has already done it. In his paper, we're doing exactly the same thing. We're going to take the regulatory requirement the companies have to disclose in the proxy filings. Any director who falls below a 75% attendance standard of board and committee meetings. That's super coarse. Okay? If you try and do this kind of research in Taiwan or Korea and so on, you will get the actual attendance at every one of these meetings, and we have 75% yes or no, okay? Which is not great. And then the final thing that we can do is we can think about monitoring synergies as being more likely when you sit on the boards of 2 companies that operate in the same industry or are vertically related to each other. That kind of works, but doesn't work really well in the data, as you're going to see. Or we can think about companies as being informationally related, and we can measure that. There's a nice RFS paper coming out of NUS a few years ago that gives us a handle on how to take any 2 companies and measure how closely informationally related they are to each other. And that one works really well in the data. Okay, so then we use data, and there's a lot of it. Okay, so the empirical design starts with shocking firm A. Okay, this is the loss of the analyst. And seeing what happens to monitoring there, and it goes up. But that's not the focus here. That's what we do in the companion paper. We just use that to get the ball rolling here. So then the first step in our empirical design here is to think about, well, what happens at the other firm's board? And how does the busy director reallocate? And that could go up or down depending on the sign of the monitoring synergies across the 2 firms. It should go up if the monitoring synergies are positive and down when they're negative. So in the data, it looks like this. When we look at same industry, which is the red lines in the first 7 columns, then you see it's a positive number, meaning you're more likely to meet the 75% attendance standard if you're shocked in one firm and the other firm on whose board you sit is in the same industry. Okay, so that kind of works, but it's no little stars, so it's not significant. When it's unrelated industries, this is where the time constraint is the only thing that's operating. You're busier here, you're going to reduce monitoring there. Okay? That one is highly significant. Then the final thing here is, well, what happens if the 2 firms are informationally related? There comes out really nicely, lots of little stars. If they're informationally related, then you're going to increase monitoring at both companies, or you're more likely to attend both companies' meetings at least 75% of the time. And if not, it goes down. So it lines up with the proposition. All right, next step is asking, what do the other directors do? And the other directors can increase or decrease the monitoring depending on now two things: the nature of the strategic interaction and the sign of the monitoring. And here, and I'm going to have to go fast, unfortunately, it lines up with the majority of the time being a case of monitoring being strategic complements. That seems to be the predominant case in the data. So I'll just take one of these coefficients, that thing there. Your busy director is getting busier on the other board. If that causes the busy director to start missing more than 25% of meetings at your joint board, then you, the other solo director on that joint board, will reduce your attendance as well. So you're moving in the same direction. Okay? So the other guy attends less, you attend less, strategic complements. I'm going to go through that in the interest of time. But there is one case, we were looking for some evidence of there being strategic substitutes at least some of the time. And we were thinking, well, what if the company is in a crisis situation? So now you've got a distracted director who's just busy over there. Are you really going to do the same thing and not attend yourself either, given that the company is in a crisis situation? Probably not. The stakes are pretty high. So probably you're going to compensate for the fact that you now have a distracted director who's busy over there by attending more yourself in these very special circumstances. And that appears to be the case in the data. So we came up with 3 different scenarios for what it means to be in a crisis. One is you become target of an activist hedge fund campaign. Second is your share price falls by 25% or more. Third one is you've got a goodwill write-off of 25% or more of assets. So these are pretty extreme events. Okay? And when they happen, you've got the solo directors making up for the reduction monitoring by the busy director. OK, we've got like a minute, -1, cool, good. So then the final thing that I need to tell you is what happens to value. So this is like, it's really heroic, okay? These are small shocks. I'm not going to find much in terms of value. So value could go up or down, depending. So what we're going to do first is an event study. What happens to your share price on the day that another company to which you're linked through a board interlock loses an analyst? Okay? And the answer is nothing. That's not even statistically insignificant. That's 0. Okay? And that's reassuring. Nothing should be happening. So you should really be expecting something only when the shock to the first firm is very, very big so that it meaningfully spills over to you. That's the only scenario in which there should be anything happening. So when we try and find these sort of meaningful shocks, thinking, for example, how many analysts are still left at the original company that loses an analyst and so on, that's where we're finding small but significant effects that spill over and whose sign reflects the nature of the monitoring synergies and the strategic interaction. Okay. All right, I'm not going to summarize because I'm out of time, but we hope to have made a little bit of a contribution towards thinking about busy directors not always being bad. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot. There's a lot going on in the paper, so I'll limit my comments to just a few pieces. It's the 3rd time that I've been a discussant at the GCGC, and every time I have exactly the same experience. I get the paper, I open it up, and as a law professor, my head starts to spin because I see all of these numbers, and this is the only conference I go to all year that I hear endogeneity. And then I will go the whole year, and I come here again, and I hear a lot of that. You won't hear me say that after this. This paper, I think I'm going to do a bit of what Jennifer did, and maybe this is sort of the law professor's excuse, but try to provide some context for this paper. And I think I'll be a bit different than Jennifer in that the context that I provide, I think provides some challenges to both the theoretical claims and also the empirical analysis. Before I get into, I guess, some of the challenges to this, I do really like what this paper is doing. And because I think in this area, there's a lot of discussion about busy directors. And I think what Alexander says is right. Generally, the intuition is that busy directors are a bad thing. And I think this is a nice additional attempt. There are a few other attempts in the literature to try to explain, well, yes, of course, we understand the fact that when directors are sitting on more than one board and 2, 3, 4, 10 boards, they start to lose the ability to monitor. But also, you know, he does a nice job of looking at this idea of monitoring synergies, that directors learn along the way, right? And I think that makes a lot of intuitive sense to say that if you're sitting on a number of boards, and the paper does a nice job of saying, well, when do you learn? And so there's a number of measures of when firms are related, when you would pick up additional skills. And that's a very useful thing, I think, to build into the model. The other thing is this idea of strategic interaction, which I think is quite nice, right? And I think intuitively, again, Alexander explained it quite well. We all realize that in boards, like any groups, you're affected by the people around you, right? And so if people are all working hard around you, you may, for certain reasons, also want to work hard because you don't want to be embarrassed by not working hard, or you could take a different approach to it, and you could say, well, everybody's working hard, and as Alexander said, I'm a person who wants to stand out, so I decide I'm not going to work hard. Of course, the difficult part of this, and this is where the paper is a heroic attempt, is trying to determine when are you going to have these monitoring synergies, when are you going to have these strategic interactions, and then as the paper tries to claim and then prove with the empirical analysis, when are these two things going to interact, and how do we measure that, and how do we prove that empirically? So I agree it's a very heroic attempt, and I like it because it tries to actually not only model something very good, but also tries to add a lot of nuance to a debate which I think, especially in the popular literature, is often presented in a way that is somewhat simplistic. However, then I start to grapple with some difficulties, and I think this is part of the challenge, and this was brought up in the last presentation as well. What do we consider being too busy, right? And I know my wife is traveling here with me, and she's always telling me I'm too busy, and I say I'm not busy enough. But in the director world, right, it's become rather clear when you're busy, in the sense that S&P 500 firms, the latest statistics I could find, the average independent director holds 2.1 board seats, right? If you look at the caps that have been put on, 49% of the caps that are put on are at 4 directors, 11% are at, the cap is at 5. As was mentioned in the previous talk, ISS had a cap at 6. It's been dropped to 5, right? And so the question that I have is, in this paper, the model is set on 2. And I would say that is not a busy director. That is the typical independent director in an S&P 500 company, right? And so even in the paper, repeatedly, there's a claim that there's an assumption that there are negative synergies for these busy directors. I would actually say that it could run the other way, that if you're sitting on 2 boards, I don't think in any jurisdiction around the world that would be seen as a negative thing. In fact, there's an interesting paper, it's now a few years back in Singapore, Mark Yuantin, who did cluster analysis, and he found out that in family firms, they stood out because most of the directors on family firms in Singapore are what he called one-firm directors. People were quite skeptical about that because that showed they're probably a family friend, and nobody else would put them on the board, right? So you actually become skeptical about the one, right? And so this idea both in the model, but then as far as I could see also in the empirical analysis, it was based upon 2 directorships with one shock being too busy, right? And I would say that that doesn't match up with the literature. Now, why is this important? And again, Alexander showed some pictures of overly busy directors, and Jonathan Miller, I like to read local papers wherever I go, and I checked the Boston Globe, and the Boston Globe says this about him, right? Former AOL chief Jonathan Miller joined so many corporate boards that even he has had trouble keeping track of them all. In fact, in the article, they asked him, and he gave a list of his boards. He couldn't even list them all. He said in 2015, he was on the boards of 8 publicly traded companies in 6 cities that collectively hold more than 100 meetings a year. Those positions are expected to pay him well over $1 million this year. Miller also sat on 11 other boards of privately held and non-profit enterprises while holding down a day job as a partner in a Norwood venture capital company. And then there's his second job advising a private equity firm in London. So, in a case like this, why is this important in the model? Why is this important in the empirical analysis? Well, if you look at one of the findings in the paper, they find that firms linked by positive monitoring synergies benefit from sharing directors, especially when their common directors find themselves becoming busier on another of their boards. And Alexander explained this, right? And in a previous draft of this paper that I actually had, they said this is counterintuitive. And indeed, I think it may be counterintuitive. The fact that you become more busy on one board means that you will then work more on the other board is indeed, to me, was counterintuitive. However, I can believe that to be the truth when you're dealing with directors on two boards. Where I start to disbelieve that this could be possible are in cases like Jonathan Miller. If he becomes busy on 17 boards, I don't think he's going to start working harder on the 18th board, right? And so, and you don't even have to go to that extreme. I would say if you have somebody on 6 boards, right? And so when you start building into the model, this, and I think you figured out quite well what your average director is doing that sits on 2.1 boards, right? But my question is that transferable to your busy director, which is what the paper is looking at. The second major point is about this shock, and I promised I wouldn't use exogenous, but I guess I will. Exogenous shock, okay? It's a natural experiment, and the interesting thing with the natural experiment is the natural experiment says this, which is that there was a decrease in sell-side analysts that are looking at firms. And the firms that experience less analysts analyzing them, so less analyst coverage, those were the shocked directors. So I did something very unscientific, but I just asked some directors in Singapore, Japan, Korea. It could be entirely different in the United States, so we can have a discussion if you think it would be similar. Do you know how many sell-side analysts are looking at your firm? One director, and I won't say who they were. What's a sell-side analyst? An independent director? You know, and the others were aware, but they had no clue how many. And what the natural experiment is saying is it's saying that there's a drop in analyst numbers and that directors make a conscious decision because of the drop to attend more meetings or monitor more. If you're not even aware of the number of analysts, never mind whether, or the ones that aren't even aware what an analyst is, but if you're not even aware of the number of analysts, how then can you decide to attend more or less board meetings based on a drop, okay? And this got me to look more at the empirics, which I tried not to do, but I was drawn into it here. And this is the description of what happened, okay? During the first year, and this is in which the firm loses coverage, right? So this is a drop in sell-side analysts. Attendance continues to be no different among treated directors and their controllers. So basically, there's a drop in sell-side analysts, and attendance is the same, okay, for a year. The second year, okay, then you start to see a statistically significant difference, meaning that there's a drop in sell-side analysts, and the shock-treated directors start to attend less. But what I found the most interesting is, then the next year, the difference goes away. So when I start thinking about this story, the story you're telling with the natural experiment is, drop in sell-side analysts, independent or directors, shock directors, do nothing. Then year one, they say, oh, there's a drop in sell-side analysts, so I need to start doing more work because we're not being externally monitored. And then after another year, they just decide, well, I don't need to do any more work. I don't know why you would do that. But that's the story that is told through the empirical findings. Right? And to me, that story doesn't really make any intuitive sense. Another question is, even if the directors are really attuned to the number of sell-side analysts, and they actually know when this drop occurs, how is attending a board meeting going to substitute for what these sell-side analysts do? So I know that there's less coverage of my company, and I'm a director. Even if I know that, and I become concerned about it, how is attending a board meeting going to replace this information that's been lost in the market? I doubt that independent directors would be able to do much about that. Now, there's some interesting research, which is mentioned in the paper, that a different paper, I believe it's by Balakrishna, that talks about this idea of a drop in sell-side analysts. And companies, they show that there is statistical evidence that companies voluntarily disclose more when there's a drop in sell-side analysts. I believe that, because that makes sense, right? The market is unaware or loses information. The company becomes concerned, especially when you go from 1 to 0. Of course, then the companies are very concerned there's not information in the market, so we replace it. But I don't know how this part of the natural experiment works. Another issue. We propose that the two factors jointly determine whether a busy board is beneficial or harmful. A, the existence of monitoring synergies across firms when directors serve on multiple boards, and B, strategic interaction among directors on a firm's board, right? So again, I believe that these two factors would be very important when you're looking at directors who are on two boards. In other words, I think the model and the empirical evidence is quite good in showing that these two factors, the strategic interaction, monitoring synergies, do a nice job in explaining probably part or most of the universe of what's going on when you're dealing with two boards. However, when you look at the directors that are these busy, excessively busy directors, okay, we're talking about directors according to most of the international and US standards. We're talking about directors on 5 or more boards. Is it really monitoring that is getting them on the board? And I would say no. You just need to go down the list of the names on Google of who these directors are, and what do you start to realize? You recognize the names. Okay, these are the rock star corporate executives, right? And that tells me that what is going on here is not a monitoring story, but a reputation story, right? That these people are ending up on the boards not because there's a monitoring effect, and that's something that I think is missing from this analysis, right, and this model. That if you're truly trying to look at the excessively busy directors, it's reputation. If you're only looking at 2 directors, I agree, reputation isn't that important. Why not? Because you're average, right? If you're the 2.1, then you don't stand out. So it's fine. We can talk about the model, and it all makes sense. But when you move into the busy director, then I think it becomes a lot more about reputation, and there's nothing in the paper that tries to look at this reputation. The last thing that I wanted to sort of focus on is this quote, which maybe doesn't mean as much, and I'm not sure how much it means to business school professors, but it definitely means a lot to comparative corporate law professors or corporate law professors. We conjecture that the directors of the affected firms, when faced with a reduction in external monitoring by analysts and by other parties that rely on the analysts' research, set up their own internal monitoring. Analyst coverage reductions resulting from brokerage closures do indeed make the directors of the shocked firms busier. What is that saying? That's basically saying that when directors are being watched less, when fewer people are monitoring them, they realize this, and they work more. From a corporate law perspective, at least in the legal literature, it's the opposite that is often assumed, right? Which is that as monitoring decreases, self-interested directors and executives work less. That they will rent seek, they will shirk. And that seems to be the common assumption. And so I just found this actually interesting because it actually turns what I would say the whole, at least the corporate law literature, or a lot of it, on its head, right? And there are people, Marty Lipton wrote an interesting piece now about 10 years back that said, yeah, this whole assumption is wrong. But it does really paint the opposite picture. And if this is indeed true, this statement, I think it would be the most important thing in the paper, right? That you're actually getting, you could think of how monitoring should just be decreased then, because then directors would wake up and say, oh, we need to work very hard to make up for this decrease in hostile takeover activity, proxy fights, and everything we look at, right? Which I think is quite extraordinary if it is true, but for the reasons I've mentioned, there's a bit of skepticism about the truth of that. At the end of the day, just to say thanks to Alexander, is an interesting paper. As he correctly indicated, it's heroic in that it tries to pull a lot of things together. It's just, I guess, the two major concerns, which are the connection between the model, the empirics, and busyness, right? How does that mesh together? Because I think busyness is a lot more than two directors, and that's very important because it's not built in. And the second thing is the natural experiment, right? The natural experiment, to me, seems to have a bit of a disconnect, although mine was just speaking with a few people on another continent. I don't know in the US. But how would you solve that? Ask directors. I would say do a survey and ask directors, do you actually know how many sell-side analysts are looking at your firm? And if they all get it wrong, then I think you can assume that they're not reacting to a drop in sell-side analysts. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to break with tradition and actually respond to the discussant and then take questions. There are a couple of red herrings here. The first red herring is 2. Okay? There's nothing special about 2 in the paper. We're not assuming 2. We're not imposing 2. There's nothing going on with 2 except that when economists model something, they have to make things tractable. Okay? And with 2 companies, things are tractable. But we're not thereby assuming that you aren't also sitting on 15 other boards, or 1 other board, or 5 other boards. And everything else that isn't in the 1 company, 2 company setup is summarized in a little parameter called tau. Okay? And if you have a really high tau because you're sitting on 5 other boards, that's absolutely captured by the model. Same in the empirics. That's a complete, and I apologize for that not being clear, but 2, there's nothing that we're assuming here. And the paper's not about 2. The heroic effort in taking the shock that we have, which is a shock that's been used in a lot of papers because it's probably the best shock of this nature that we have in the literature, is fully acknowledged. Okay? But we do have a lot of evidence that goes beyond anecdote, beyond asking people whether they know how many analysts cover their stock. And the evidence comes from large sample studies that are causal and all that kind of thing, that emphasize that companies manage their information environments. Companies, not boards. Okay? So when companies lose an analyst, we know from reasonably good papers that companies take curative action. They don't do that when they lose 1 of 50 analysts, but they do that when they lose 1 of 5 analysts. And that curative action has been shown by Balakrishnan and me and various other people on that paper to come in the form of voluntary disclosure, and there are other papers that look at other dimensions of companies managing their information environment. And some of these curative actions would have to go through the board. Okay? So the chain of reasoning would be something like you lose an analyst, and that's a big shock to your information environment, which is not true of every firm, but if that's the case, then the company will think about what can we do about this, and the company will do a bunch of different things about it, some of which go through the board. So I don't think that directors really sort of track which analyst is covering them, but it comes up at the board. Now, we would like to then measure something that's a little better than how many meetings do you attend, or do you attend more than 75% of meetings. But we're not thereby implying, because we can't, that attending a meeting is the same as learning more about the company. Okay, so monitoring effort is something other than attending a meeting. But if you're putting in more monitoring effort, if you're trying to get independent signals about how the company is doing or what value you can add to the company because you're losing this external signal from the analyst, then whatever it is that you're collecting out there makes it easier for you to show up at the board meetings because now there's a point to showing up. Now you have something to contribute because you're now better informed than you would have been. So it lowers the marginal cost of attending that board meeting, which is the one little thing that we can pick up in the data, which is super coarse and super noisy, for sure. Okay? We'd like to measure inputs. How much time do you spend on this company? And clearly we cannot do that. So I think those are the two really big things here. On the timing, this is a short-lived response. So it shows up after you lose the analyst, you're showing up more to the board, and then it dies down because the company is taking curative action. The information environment over time is being restored. So the need for you to be paying extra attention to this company, I think makes sense to be short-lived, and it shows up in the data to be short-lived. If you were still more likely to attend 5 years later, that would be weird, I think, in the data. So with that, let me open it up to questions. Are you going to take them? Or?
So I find your last explanation to be persuasive, but I was curious if you can go a bit in more detail. Analysts serve a lot of functions, which could be quite persistent. They're writing reports, they're helping you communicate to the marketplace. So what do you have in mind in terms of the curative action that's being taken when you lose one analyst that's only showing up 1 year? In other words, that's not persistence. Because I can imagine lots of analyst services and activities being quite persistent, but you have something else in mind.
Yeah, so what we show in the Balakrishnan et al. JF paper is that companies take curative action in the form of increased voluntary disclosure of information. And we're measuring the easy-to-measure stuff there, which is earnings guidance, okay, which I think is the tip of that very, very large iceberg of the communication that the company is increasing to the market, but that one's really easy to measure. And within a short space of time, which kind of maps into what we're seeing here, the information environment is restored if you look at measures like liquidity in the market. If you lose an analyst, your liquidity dips. Then the company responds to that, releases more information, and the liquidity recovers. Yeah, so they're continuously increasing. That's exactly right. Fine, but the way that we think about it is that in that adjustment period before the company has taken its curative action, it pays you as a director to pay more attention to the company. Right?
I was also conceptually persuaded by the answer, but I still think that the magnitude of the effect that I would expect is pretty small, and so the power is pretty small. So I was wondering, there are other things that happen to directors. The other firm A is being taken over or is doing a big acquisition or something like that. Whether you've looked at that or why not what you found.
Yeah, so we haven't yet, and we will, I think. We're being a little bit Puritan here. We want a shock that's randomly assigned. We want the first firm to be shocked for reasons that are completely unrelated to that firm. And then we can trace out what the directors on that firm are doing in response, and we can see how that spills over to the other company, and everything is nicely random. If we look at things like the first firm is being taken over or is going through trouble or something, then we can't rule out that the firm is being taken over or is in trouble because of the quality of its board. And then the design becomes contaminated. So we will do what you're suggesting, right? But it is, from a Puritan point of view, less good than what we have, but it's better in the sense that it's a bigger shock. The bigger the shock, the more likely it is that we can trace something out. Okay, and that's a trade-off.
Just a couple of thoughts. I guess I can't help but note that I've got a forthcoming paper on distracted independent directors on the JFE, where we look at things like illness, accidents, major awards, as well as distractions at other companies when you're on multiple boards. And we look at both good distractions as well as bad distractions, and we find very clear evidence for both either good distractions or bad that the performance of the firm, the first firm where the director is distracted is negatively impacted in terms of valuation and in terms of performance. M&A performance drops, earnings management declines, and we find that the effect is much stronger if it's a more important director who's a chairman of a committee or is not co-opted, and a variety of other cross-sectional tests. But we get very strong, I think, evidence that the distraction seems to be on that very negative.
Okay, good. The more the merrier.
Jeff, you go second.
Okay.
Or not.
Oh.
Jeff, no, hold it. You're next, but after you.
Oh, we can do a duet.
Well, that would be
Okay. So so my first question has to do with, so if I well understood, you infer from the data whether or not the directors of firm B are complements or substitutes. And I was wondering why you do this as opposed to getting some measure and then testing the model. I was thinking in terms of checking their background. Say if you have both of them having experience in finance, you could think about them more as being substitutes than complements. And the second point is sort of minor, but as for the goodwill impairments, so when you look at those, you're already restricting to the companies that are acquirers, and my sense is that these impairments are fairly infrequent. Well, I checked this data a while ago, but this is my sense.
Yeah, these are very extreme events, right? That's why they're chosen. But we're not restricting the sample to those events. It's a treatment. Okay, it's a treatment that hits a very small number of companies.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that you're already in a selected sample. So for you to have goodwill in your balance sheet, you have to have acquired. So you're sort of looking only inside a subset.
Sure. Yeah. So to answer the question, why are we asking the data? What is the predominant mode of interaction on a board? It's a long paper. We're innovating on a number of fronts already. So I think we have to scale back our ambition here and leave some work for others or for ourselves to do in a follow-on paper. But there is a literature in personnel economics that thinks about why people in a team interact in the way that they do. And they're both sort of sociological kind of explanations. You want to stand out from the crowd, or you care about the stigma of being seen to shirk and things like that. And there are more economic-based models out there as well. Tirol has theory models, etc. And one could easily think about taking those kinds of theory models that exist in the personnel economics literature into the board context and then try and test them, which is not what we're doing here, but it's really exciting to do. And I think our ambition here is twofold, both opening up the debate on the busyness of directors and making it a little less one-sided, but also, and perhaps it's the bigger contribution, to introduce into this thinking, this economic thinking about boards, the notion that boards are not monolithic entities, but teams, and the interaction within those teams are interesting and have been completely ignored so far. There's more work done on baseball teams in the economic literature than on boards as teams, because our paper is the only one. So we're keeping that on our to-do list, and somebody needs to do that and maybe get ahead of us. But I think that's really interesting. We just haven't done it.
First, I think the point you've just made is really important, that the notion of busyness in some simple quantitative way to measure the value of a director to a board is kind of ridiculous. I mean, it's crude, right? But following a point that was just made, you know, looking at it from a lawyer's perspective, why not pick a shock, like, you know, an enforcement action brought against the firm? I mean, you don't have to use a takeover, which is a final period, and is, you know, the stakes are so high that, of course, they're not going to do anything else with other boards. But you know, a more common event that actually involves things that the shareholders would really care about and would be require the director to do a lot of stuff rather than just learn a little bit more, perhaps. So the sense of the shock being a more real one. And then secondly, to figure out the effect is what the director learned in the case of shock 1 going to change the way that a board on which the director then sits or comes to sit responds to a similar shock at a later time, right? So if you have an activist challenge and you're sitting on a board and the result is an outcome, is that going to affect the chances of the and that's regarded by the market, let's say, in some sort of quantitative test. Is that going to affect the outcome of a board on which the director also sits or later sits in a way that is better or worse than the outcome that was achieved in the first case? And so I guess the idea of looking at what directors learn on boards and to transmit that information to other boards and what's the right way of thinking about the way to do that is really important. But so this is, I'll say this is a first step, but lawyers would want you to push on to other things.
Okay, being pushed is good. To answer your first question, there's nothing inherently wrong with thinking about the kind of shock that you're saying, enforcement action and so on, except it makes the paper much harder to publish because enforcement actions are not random. Well, you know, the way the finance literature has gone is that we care about dealing with heterogeneity, and enforcement actions don't happen randomly. So there's something about the firm that attracts this particular shock, and then we are in trouble methodologically, which is not to say that we're not going to try. Okay, so we'll probably have a table doing all these various shocks, and it will confirm, hopefully, what we find. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think economists are sort of fundamentally lazy if they can just summarize everything that you just said in one variable and call it experience, and then measure it with something really simple like number of years of sitting on boards, tick and move on kind of thing, right? But I think what you're suggesting is much more interesting, right? So what are the I don't know, life lessons that you've learned elsewhere, right, in your professional life? And does that make you a more effective, not monitor, but more effective director? That's the kind of hands-on work that we tend to shy away, perhaps with some exceptions, shy away from, which is not to say that we shouldn't do it.
Right. Not so much of a question to you, but more like a possible explanation to Charles's question about the persistence. So it could be that the analysts who were fired because of the brokerage merger or closure, they are rehired by other brokerage firm and reassigned to cover the same firm. So then the information asymmetry is gained after 1 year or so.
So no, it doesn't happen. I mean, clearly it happens from time to time, but this is a net decline in employment in the brokerage industry. And these guys are moving either to a nice island in the Caribbean or to the buy side. And when they're on the buy side, their signals, the research that they're producing is private. It's private to that institution. It's not being shared with the wider market. So the information asymmetry in the market changes, the information environment changes, companies take curative action and so on.
So it's mostly the disclosure of the firm that is undoing the information asymmetry?
That's, I think that's the big one that the literature has so far shown.
Okay.
But this, just one little thing, it's going to get worse. MiFID II, right, is killing the analyst industry. So everything that has ever been shown happens when there's an exogenous change in coverage or decline in coverage. That's just going to accelerate. Okay? Lots of experiments in the data for us.
Okay, 3 more questions. Bias, Lucian,
you just cut me off if I didn't get it right. But I think in one of the empirical tests, you said that the positive externalities only accrue if the firms are from the same industry. And I think you can challenge that because it's intuitive if the externalities actually accrue due to in the operative sector. But if you think about compliance organization or how you structure the alchemy of structuring executive compensation, then you can still learn even if it's not the same industry. So I would be a little bit cautious about this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So when we did the Are You in the Same Industry and called that Positive Synergies, that was a very intuitive first step in that direction. It doesn't actually work very well in the data because you're barred, now lawyers to the fore, but you're barred from sitting on the boards of competing companies in the US. So you can't actually, very tightly be in the same industry. And we don't find anything with that variable either. So it goes in the right direction, but we have no power because there are far too few directors who sit on the boards of companies in the same industry because they're not allowed to. Sure.
So a comment to add my voice to those that are skeptical about this particular shock, but also suggestions about alternative shocks. So one is, I'm sure that there are people who read 5 analyst reports, but I've never met a director that told me that he read 5 analyst reports. So my guess is it would be interesting for you to maybe do just a small survey among a bunch of directors and ask them, because it's possible that moving from 5 to 4 doesn't affect them at all because they might not read any or they might read 1. Secondly, what's not clear to me is, let's suppose we know that on average they spend just 200 hours a year. Let's suppose they have some small amount for analyst reports and then they read the documents and they have the meetings. It's possible, your hypothesis is that when they don't get an analyst report from 5 to 4, then they go out themselves and they try to spend time to produce something that would be a substitute. But it might be that they just read 4 instead of 5 and do everything as they did before, and therefore they have more time for the other board. So all of that is just skepticism, just to add to my friend Jeff. Now, just to be constructive, here are suggestions because for things that maybe might be kosher with the journals. So one, you can have deaths of CEOs. 2, you can have natural disasters. So if you have hurricanes and other things in the state of headquarters. 3, you could have regulatory or political actions in the industry. So for example, right now, probably all the steel company directors are distracted.
They're busy, yep.
So, all of those things, it seems like the standards are getting high, but all those things seem to be kosher even with the current high standards.
Just before Renee asks the last question, when Alexander's done with the response to the last 2 questions, everybody sit still just for a minute because there's some questions I want to put on.
Okay, so I really like the actual modeling of the team. That's really great because I've been saying this for years and people have not yet done enough. So I think that's really, really excellent. One question I have here is whether the relevant team is the board or the committee. Because you can imagine that the strategic complementarities and or substitution actually happens at the committee level, not at the board level. And so I would be interested to see whether your results get stronger if you focus on directors from the same committee or other committees. And the other point is that I ran these regressions a while ago, so I don't know if it's still true in the data. The busy directors usually tend to sit on committees like the nominating committee, which makes a lot of sense because they know a lot of people, right? And so, there might be 2 kinds of busy directors, those who actually do the monitoring and the others who are there for other reasons, like Dan pointed out. So also there, I'd be interested from a modeling perspective if you added sort of like other benefits, so not just the monitoring, but what about if they bring other things to the table, right? Because you could think they're complementary inputs, advice or networking or reputation or whatever. So that would be an interesting thing to extend if possible. I know it's difficult, but also, again, if you separated out the busy directors who are actual monitors versus the other ones, that might.
Okay, so I'm going to respond very quickly, and then I guess we have to do things like thank yous and drinks. So the model does not have a role for trophy directors, which I think is the point that Dan brought up. So you have names on your board of directors who are not going to be monitors. But I think the model could easily be extended in that direction. You could even just reinterpret one of the parameters, the productivity of the director as capturing these other inputs that the director can bring to the table, connections, networks, that kind of thing. On the committee side, I can tell you that the one committee in which the strategic interaction really pops out is the audit committee. Okay? If you put more effort in, the others put more effort in there as well. And that's where the result is really, really, really strong. And if you're distracted, you're not showing up, then audit committee interaction goes down. So I think that's interesting, but that's as far as we've pushed that. I mean, could randomly be that person, possibly. The one person in the industry. And then Lucian's points, yeah, I mean, we're definitely trying very, very hard to find other shocks that the literature will accept. Because the shock that we have, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it, but it's a small shock. Okay? And because it's a small shock, we're going to find very small effects, if any. And we have to push the data really, really hard to find anything. We don't find anything on average. We only find things when we look at amongst the shocks, the really meaningfully large shocks and so on, all of which I think makes sense, but it's hard, right? And the only reason why we're finding anything at all, which is always going to be small, is because we have a lot of power. We've got a lot of observations. If we had a bigger shock, it wouldn't be so hard. So we're completely open to the idea of finding other shocks or replacing the shock with something better and so on. But that's work in progress. All right. Thank you very much.
Now, two important sets of thank yous. The first to Alan for his chairmanship of the conference committee, because it's been a wonderful event. Thank you. To Elaine, because without her astonishing, I'm sorry, and Vanessa, without their astonishing ability to organize this smoothly, it wouldn't have mattered what Ellen did, because it wouldn't have worked. Now the third thank you, which some of you have heard part of before, but I'm going to repeat it anyway. This marks the last conference on which Hideki is sitting on the GC board, and those of us who've worked on the board understand that it's a team. And we also understand that not everybody on the team cooperates and contributes to the same thing. Hideki has been contributing astonishingly since the beginning, and his stepping down will be a difficult set of shoes to fit, because the number of ways he helped create this organization and get it to the point where it is astonishing, and we owe him a great thank you. We also have something for him. Speaking of boards of directors, we have a book of a wonderful photography book that is pictures of the most lovely boardrooms in Europe. Part of what makes it lovely, there are no directors in them. Hideki, it's been a pleasure working with you these years, and we are all grateful, and we're not going to let you go.